Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Summit Podcast. I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about babies, infants, toddlers, especially when it comes to being in the service and, the parents kind of question on, do we put the kids in the nursery? Do we keep them in service? And kind of how churches respond to that sort of thing. So, joining me today for this topic is the one who's probably a little bit more invested in this topic than me because my kids are way past the infancy stage of life. So, Micah Current, Micah, how are you doing today?
Your kids are just raising it during service.
Oh, yes, that is true.
Uh, I'm good. Always good to be here.
Yeah. So,
Well, by the
as we
time this
get,
episode drops, the election will have happened.
I know
Are you feeling tense?
I'm not like I'm
I don't
not
feel as
because
tense as I did in 2020.
yeah, I'm not, and I don't, and I think if there's going to be any tense, it's just going to be kind of what happens afterwards. And not because I'm, again, I think I'm in a good place and I'm in a good community where we know that, hey, even though my politics and your politics may not be aligned,
Or,
we're a family in Christ and we keep things cordial and that's it. Like, we kind of have that reassurance, you know what I mean? But now if I was still living in Virginia, it'd be a different story. So it'd be a different story
because
because even
because of the church you were at or the community you were in.
it's just the culture. Like and the reason why I say that, and I think I might have mentioned it before, is where I lived before. Like I lived in a small little city that when you look at like the voting map of this city and you look at the county it's in, Stanton was the blue island in the sea, in the Red Sea that was Augusta County. So just that alone, just because it would just cause a lot of tension. Because you had people who lived in the city of Stanton who primarily voted more Democrat. A lot of people who went to church who may either live in Stanton or maybe live out in Augusta County and they travel into Stanton because it's such a small little community anyway. Like, they primarily vote Republican. So anytime when there's politics from a local election all the way up to the federal elections, it just was tense all the time. So,
So 24 hours the day before, as of the date of the recording, if you were a betting man, what do you think's going to happen?
um,
If you were casting lots,
I don't know. It's
you
very
don't.
I don't know. Like and I
If
mean
you were
the only
guessing,
if I was it's hard for me to guess, Micah. Like it's very hard for me to
well, people
guess
have
just
asked me. The reason I asked that, people have asked me,
mhm.
and I say either Trump's going to win in a landslide, or it's going to be really, really close, just like 2021.
Mm.
It's one of the two things.
And I think and for me, and it also depends on where you live and what stuff you're watching. Because Laura and I went on a date yesterday, and we were just sitting and we are watching like football, and I think it was on Fox. I think it was whoever Detroit and Green Bay, like whatever station that was on, and a lot of the
Oh, the Fox Network.
commercials, yeah, the Fox Network or Fox Sports, and a lot of the commercials were very much, which is not surprising, anti-Kamala, pro-Trump. And if I was just to sit there and watch football all day, I would probably assume, man, Trump's going to win this thing. And yet, since mostly I watch stuff on streaming, so like with Amazon or YouTube, or like my kids watch YouTube and stuff, like you would think that Kamala Harris was going to win. And
Well,
or it's going to be a tight contest between Bernie Moreno and Sherrod Brown because you see both the
yeah, I was going to
bad
say
and
that
the
too.
good.
I was going to say that too because like I've noticed a lot of like I watch a lot of YouTube just I follow a bunch of different channels, and
Hmm.
sometimes before I go to bed, I watch just a bunch of YouTube videos before I fall asleep, so I don't have to pick something out on streaming.
Yeah.
But I've noticed on YouTube that it's the ads are more local, like
Hmm.
you know, in reference to my state.
Yeah.
We're both in Ohio. Like just like you said, Sherrod Brown or Bernie Marino. Like it's more about the Senate race. It's more about city, state, things like that, local and statewide. And you don't hear as much about the presidential stuff. So
Hmm.
um, something I heard the other day was fascinating. Was like that this is probably the first election where social media influence will play probably the biggest role in
Mm.
respect to persuading people's votes, whether it's millennials, Gen Z, et cetera, because people have such just this massive influence on social media, whether it's TikTok or YouTube, and I think of
Hmm.
Joe Rogan, for example. I don't know if you got a chance to watch that, but like he did interviews with Donald Trump and JD Vance, and the Donald Trump thing has been on there less than 2 weeks, and it's got over 42 million views.
Hmm.
JD Vance has got 10 million views. They did the Theo Vaughn. I don't know if you've heard of him,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
he's a pretty big deal in the podcasting world,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
he had Trump on his podcast as well, and same thing with JD Vance. But like these people are getting millions and millions and millions of hits on their podcasts, and same thing with TikTok. If I'm scrolling through TikTok, I'm seeing these like one day it's like, okay, it's like razor sharp 49%, 49% in all the battleground states. The next day it's Kamala is up by 5 and 4 of the battleground states. And then the next day Trump's up by 10 and 1, but not all. And it's like,
Yeah.
how did they change that quick? And who are they asking?
So and that's the thing too. And I mean, it's also how are you dealing with all those ballots that got burned over on the West Coast?
Oh, and
Like
in Oregon.
in
Was it
Oregon
Oregon or
and
Seattle,
Oregon,
Washington? I don't remember what it was.
it was Oregon, Seattle, Colorado, and I believe there's another state, but I think it was more like central. But yeah, like you're gonna have to deal with that. And I think that's the thing, like my pastor, she does every election, whether it's a federal election or a local election, she always works the ballots. That's just kind of like her thing. And she was telling me like all these different stories, like when people were voting from their cars, like during COVID, like how like she and like if she's a registered Democrat, then there'd be a registered Republican that would have to go out to a car. They both would have to sit there and watch this person fill out their form, and then when they would hand it to them, they both would have to grab it. She'd have to grab a corner, the other person would have to grab a corner, and they both would have to put it in the envelope and seal it and put it away. Like Ohio has some pretty strict like voting integrity laws as far as how to do things properly. And she was saying now, because of everything with the election being stolen and all that stuff 4 years ago, they are now having another layer of protection, which is you're going to have like someone from, I think it's someone from the federal, someone who's like a federal agent, basically is standing over all these poll workers, making sure they're doing everything right, making sure they're checking licenses, making sure the signatures like, and I'm thinking, my goodness, like it's already pretty good already. And now it's like we're gonna make it, it's like we're not doing two-tier factoring here, we're doing three-tier factoring when it comes. So I think that's and I think, not necessarily because I know there's some other states who may not have that same type of like care when it comes to and security when it comes to voting. But yeah, I think it's just, I mean, either way, it's gonna be it's gonna be hot. And and I'm just glad that I'm in a community where, whatever happens, happens. And people may be upset, people may grumble a little bit, but it's not to the extreme that I had to deal with when I was living in Virginia. So yeah.
Well, too, like I think that I think when I was in college, when I was an undergrad, I think John McCain and Barack Obama were running for office, and
Hmm.
it was in 2008, and that was the first time that Barack Obama won. And I wasn't a big. I remember being like the second or third time second, yeah, second time I had voted ever, and so I voted Republican. I voted for John McCain, but I remember just thinking to myself when I heard that Barack Obama had won that it really didn't change my life. You know what I mean? Like it didn't really just like the person that I didn't vote for won the election. Did it? I mean, has my life significantly changed because Barack Obama was president? No. Um, you know, my life continued on. My, you know, that was a weird time anyway with the stock market crashing and the recession in 2008. But like it
Yeah.
just, you know, and the same thing in 2012. And he got reelected against Mitt Romney, and it was like, well, all right, we'll just get another 4 years of. At the end of the day, like it's just, we could just say as Christ follows Jesus is King and Lord of Lords, and that it's going to be okay, which we believe that. But I don't really stress about it like I used to. Like when I was a
Hmm.
kid, I would just, egg people on and argue with them to argue with them. But like now, it's like I do have my beliefs and my stances, and having this conversation with you, I feel like you do too. But like it at the end of the day, it's not going to be a deal breaker for us.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, which actually I do have a pretty interesting stories gone wild if you want to
Okay.
transition to
Yeah.
that.
Transition right into stories gone wild.
So yesterday, Ohio has early voting, and they were going to do. Uh, we went to church yesterday, went to the grocery store, grabbed lunch. We were going to go try to do the early voting thing. And so where we live, um, we're driving to the Board of Elections in Butler County, and I noticed all this traffic, and I'm like, it's Sunday. Is there so much traffic? And so we're driving, and there's this line, and I think it's people turning up because you can turn left and you can go to Hamilton, or you can just keep going straight and go to the Board of Elections. So we get up to the Board of Elections, there's a line wrapped around the building for people to do early voting. And the hours were like 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock yesterday. Sunday is the date of this recording, and we record on Mondays. And so Alicia and I are like, we got the baby, we got groceries in the car. There's just no way, right? There's no way we're going to get in to vote. So we turn around, and Scott, for the next quarter of a mile, there was cars backed up, waiting to get in to do early voting. I
Hmm.
just like, you see on the news how they're talking about all these like, um, it's like a record number for early voting. And I'm like, I guess I didn't believe it, or I just didn't think anything of it. But I was like, man, I wanted, and then like our babysitter, person that watches our daughter, um, she went a couple weeks ago and voted, and she's like, yeah, it was easy. We went in, voted, we ran, we were out, we're done. I was thinking it's Sunday, it's not going to be busy.
Yeah. Well,
It was,
I think the closer you get to the election, it's going to get more and more because people are thinking like, oh, and then you get to and then you realize like, oh crap, I don't want to have to go on election day because it's going to be a nightmare.
well, we're going
I
to
mean,
have to get up really, really early tomorrow, like to go, because we're not going to do it afterward. We're going to do it on our way. And I think they open at 6 or 6:30.
mhm.
And so we're going to go, and the polls are at our high school, or I'm sorry, our middle school, which is on the way to work, but still, it's
Yeah,
crazy,
I might
crazy
have to do that
times.
too because we're still supposed to have staff meeting at 10 o'clock, and I'm like, and the polling place is just a walk for me, so it's like I don't have to go too far, but um, yeah, it's gonna be interesting. So I might have to like, bite the bullet, get up early so I can walk over there and get in line just so I can get in and vote because I know it's gonna be wild and I don't want to have my two kids like poking and teasing each other while I'm waiting in line.
What's your
I don't want
kids off for today?
I don't I don't know why they're off today. I don't know why they're off on I can get why they're off on Tuesday because I guess they're taking the election off, but I don't understand why they're off on Monday. It's like Bexley school system has the weirdest days
Schedule.
off. Like they had like a day off every single almost every single week last month, and now they have 2 days off in November, and then they'll have a week for Thanksgiving. I'm like, how often are you in school, kids? Like, I don't get it. But yeah. Oh boy. Well, my story's gone wild was pretty comical because have we did a All Saint service. I'm not sure if you know what that is.
No.
So basically what it is it's a way that the church honors the church members who have passed away in the
Oh yeah.
past year. So we have candles and we have their names, we light candles, and then we asked everyone else, like, hey, if there was a saint that passed away that was very influential in your life, bring a candle, or we have some candles with you. You'll write your name, and then during the service, we'll go collect the candles, we'll bring them up, we'll light all the candles, and then it's kind of like a remembrance of those who passed away that were very influential in our Christian walk. So, it was pretty cool. So I got to experience the first service. So the first service, my son was a got to have like one of those like canes that like you light that you do the candles. So he's up there lighting all the candles with another student while the kids went and gathered all the candles and papers from everybody, and we would like put up the names and light the candles. But then we got to the 11 o'clock service, and then we had communion afterwards. So it's like, okay, so everything was great. First service, second service, we go, we collect the candles, we get them up, we light them, we start taking communion. And then as the ushers are bringing the bread back, because we're all doing it together, we're eating the bread together, and then we go and we pass out the juice, and then we do the juice together. So they're starting to stack the trays of the communion bread. And I kind of just out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that one of the plates is slanted, like it's not set all the way. And next thing you know, after the pastor puts all the plates on, she goes to grab the other plate, and you just see four plates slide off and hit the floor, and bread flies everywhere, all over the floor. And so I'm sitting there, and so then they're going and they're picking up everything, and all the ushers are there scooping up the bread. I go over and I just adjust it because I know if they scoop all that bread in there and they put it back on there, it's going to fall again. So I'm like, click, got that taken care of. It was fine. So then last night, I go and I just watch the live service again, and I go right to that part because again, I can't laugh, even though I thought it was kind of funny. I wasn't gonna laugh, but then I played it, and right when I watched it, I died laughing. I haven't laughed so hard in my life. It was so funny. But anyway, I thought that was just wild how, and then of course afterwards, the pastor goes, "Well, I hope this isn't symbolism for something." It just went on with the service. Which made it even more funnier that she's able to laugh and kind of make a joke like, oops, all the communion elements fell. But yeah, so that's kind of my story's gone wild. So as we shift gears, we're going to kind of talk about infancy right now, as far as bringing infants in the church. And I think one of the challenges, especially as a parent, especially when Peter was first born, I know a lot of times it was difficult for Laura just to put Peter into the nursery by himself and walk away. Like, I think for at least for the first part, I felt like Laura would have him in service, and then if she needed to feed Peter, she would then go into the nursery, kind of feed Peter, and just kind of sit in there and talk with the other nursery workers a little bit. And then if he felt good or she wanted to get back into service, she would then bring him back into the service. Um, I know some parents, they're fine, like, hey, here's some diapers, here's my diaper bag, here's my toddler, boop, bye, and they go off in the service. So, so Micah, since you've had, you know, your daughter who's 3, 4 months now, four, um, what has been you and Alicia's like protocol when you're bringing your daughter into church? Do you have her with you the whole time? Do you drop her off in the nursery? Kind of explain to me kind of your thinking, your process when you're bringing your daughter to church.
Well, kind of as you explained that, with Laura and your kids were little, um, something that our primary doctor has told us is that postpartum depression can last up to 2 years for any sort of postpartum symptoms. And while you were thinking about that, like, I'm not saying that Laura had that by any means, but I'm just saying that, like, there could be that feeling of unrest as a parent, leaving your kid alone with somebody that you have no idea who they are. Um, and that, even though it's church people and you're like, well, I should trust these people, you don't know these. So, like, you know, you just came home from the hospital a couple weeks ago. You have a newborn baby, and you're not just going to leave your kid with somebody you have no idea who it is. That's just my opinion.
Mm.
Um, when when we had Audrey, we went to church like the week after she was born. She was like a week old. Um, the first couple of months, I mean, she would sleep through service, like it wasn't that big of a deal. And then about a couple of weeks ago, we she started to find her voice and make all these noises, whether it's cooing or cackling or whatever you want to call it. Um, and so she's been a little bit more vocal. And so, like, Alicia, we were sitting in service, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and Alicia was holding her and she was making all this noise. She's like, I'm going to go take her out into the lobby. Uh, Probably got to change her diaper anyway, but I'm going to go out into the lobby. And these old people behind us were just laughing the whole time that she was making all this noise in the middle of church. And, Pastor Mike's up there preaching, and all I could hear is my daughter in the back in the lobby. And I'm sitting in the middle of the sanctuary, and she's making all this noise. Um, Another thing I've seen churches do a lot recently are the cry rooms
Mm.
where like it's new mother, new child, new infants. It's basically a room that has a changing table and a couch and uh, a rocking chair, or whatever you want to call that, that you can rock your baby to sleep. Um, Privacy room, uh,
Mm.
feeding room, something like that. But the church we've been going to has that, and so a lot of times for the first couple of months, especially if we had to step out of service with her, we would take her in that room. And so we're still the ones watching her. We're still the ones, giving her care. Um, and Alicia and I've had that conversation. It's like, what do we do, in respect to nursery care? Like, they do have nursery, they do have childcare. When are we going to be ready to do that? When are we going to be ready to pull that trigger? And I think up until the point, like, it's you know been us, right? Us and our sitter, and then my in-laws have been the only ones to really like keep her for a long period of time without our supervision. Um, I guess, I mean, I know that you kind of oversee children's. Does that include nursery?
Yeah.
And what kind of like background checks do you have people go through? What kind
Hmm.
of um, protocol do you have people go through with childcare and church where you're at?
Yeah. So the United Methodist Church has a so let me go back. With the Church of God doesn't really have and by what I mean by this, they don't have like a national thing that says this is what you need to do when it comes to child safety. Most every church has to come up with their own like child protection policy. So a lot of times when I would be going to a church, like especially some of the smaller churches I pastored, they didn't have a child protection policy. So a lot of times I knew Talmage, the church I grew up in, had a good one that Doug Walter really designed and went through and did the homework and the research to figure out, what was going to be good. So with that being said, I would get, I would just always ask him for his CPC stuff, and I would end up getting it, and then go through it and kind of customize it that would fit our standards. Now, I mean, one of the big things was is that all the doors, all the rooms that we had for the nursery had a window, so you could look in there. We always required the door be open, but in case of the kids being loud, you could shut the door, but you could still see inside. Two people need to be in the road, and you also need to do background checks. Everybody had to do a background check. Um, we did allow youth in the nursery to kind of help assist, but again, they had to be, I think they had to be at least 13 years old or older. So that was kind of it. Now, the UMC, they have a thing called Safe Sanctuary, and it's a big national policy that all churches kind of abide to. And their big thing is very extensive as far as nursery work, children, Sunday school, travel with students, like all that stuff is pretty big time. So I say all that to say that you get to a point where you are really good at navigating that. Now, again, we still do background checks. Like I'm in charge of all background checks, not just for volunteers that work with children, but any single person, whether it's an employee or a volunteer, um, I have to do a background check for them, especially since we have a preschool. So it's pretty extensive. So
Yeah.
so that's and I think the one thing that is helpful, and I think this one thing that Talmadge did well is when they developed their child protection policy, when new families would come in with children and they would check in or they would want to, or they go to the welcome center, they had a pamphlet, like a little pamphlet that explained we have a child protection policy. Here's how all of our workers have background checks. All of our workers, there should always be two people in a room at all times. We break it down pretty, and we don't cut corners. Like if I have a team that for some other reason, like they're out sick and I don't have the workers to have Sunday school, then I just make an announcement first thing in the morning, because we don't do like most churches do where they come in, they check their kids in and they go in the Sunday school and don't even set foot into the sanctuary. Like we always have a time we're in the sanctuary. I just make an announcement saying, hey, due to lack of volunteers and them being sick, we're not having Sunday school today, so your kids are going to stay in service. And that's what we do. Um, and we just kind of go and do it like that because that's what we have to do to make sure that we're following our safe sanctuary guidelines. Uh, yeah. So, one of the things that I find fascinating, because you mentioned, there's these rooms that, cry rooms or these special rooms for like new mothers to go into that have changing tables, breastfeeding and stuff. One thing that I've always heard people say, and you probably might have heard it too, like, oh, a healthy church is a church where you hear kids making noises in the sanctuary, right? They always say that, like, oh, a crying kid in a sanctuary is better than no children noises at all in a church. It shows that there's life in the church. I always see those memes, people say it all the time, etc. However, even though we hear that, do churches actually, especially church administration or your pastoral staff, do they actually think the same way? And the reason why I say that is because years ago, when I was still in Youngstown, Ohio, one of my friends who's a church of God minister who's pastoring a church in the area, she resigned. She started going to Russ City Church, which is kind of like a big mega church within the Youngstown area. And her kids at this point were probably maybe toddlers, so like maybe 3 or 4. Well, one of her sons wanted to go into the toddler area. Her other son, for whatever reason, wanted to be really close to his mom and wanted to sit in service. So she's like, okay. So they're sitting in service. They're having a time of worship. Pastor starts preaching. For her account of the story, her son wasn't making a lot of noise, but he'd ask something like, oh, mom, do you have like goldfish or a snack or something? He'd ask questions. Well, there was somebody on staff from the church, like a usher or greeter, that came down to the row and basically told her, you need to put your son into the toddler area. And she's like, why? He wants to sit in service with me. Why do I have to move him? And basically said, well, because your kid's making too much noise and it's interfering with the live recording for the service. So he needs to leave and go into the children's area. And that was the last time they went to that church, because it was just like, my kid wants to be in service with me. he didn't want to go in there, and yet you're now forcing him to go in there because you're worried about the recording for the live stream. And I mean, I thought when I heard that, I'm like, well, first of all, I heard that I go, well, for a big mega church, how do they not have a good live stream sound setup where you can't hear crowd audiences or hearing a kid like maybe goo gooing and gagaing? Like really? Like what's the deal with that? But second of all, that someone was very adamant. Like even my friend was like, hey, he wants to sit with me. He wants to be in big people worship time, and even was just being very polite. Like this person was very adamant and very like strong, saying, no, your kid needs to come to the toddler area. Like they're not allowed to be in here, which I find pretty strange and pretty aggressive that someone had the gall to do that. So what are your thoughts, Micah?
Well, I do have thoughts, but I think that, you know, it's it's fascinating that people will do that or find the need to do that, and handle situations that way when there's obviously, um, more than one way to handle a situation, and as a result, that people didn't go back to that church. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, I think I would have handled it kind of in respect to, all right, we have children's ministry. I would talk to the person and be like, listen, we have this if you're interested, but not push it on them and not tell them they have to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as a person who's done the media side of things and the tech side of things, like it, it's unless the kid's screaming, it's really not going to be that big of a deal, and it's not going to be picked up by the microphone. And just a little lesson in sound and audio. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you, Scott, are preaching and you have a lapel mic on, which is the mic that's connected to your suit or your tie or wherever it is,
Or
or a
over my
headset that
ear.
goes over
Yeah.
your
Mm-hmm.
ear, and it goes right next to your mouth, people that is not going to pick up, a kid screaming in the third to back row,
Mm-hmm.
or a kid asking his mom if he wants some, a snack during the service in the third row from the back, going, all the way up to the platform, to the microphone, to the live stream. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to pick that up. Um, Now, if a kid like ran across the platform while the pastor was preaching and tripped and fell and screamed bloody murder, yes, of course it's going to pick that up. But in the situation that you're presenting and the conversation that you're presenting, it's not going to, make or break the situation.
Well, I do know that sometimes I know some churches have like a mic that specifically to pick up crowd noise for singing, like when they
Sure,
do a mix. But I
but
still
that's
feel
during
like,
worship. It's not
yeah,
during
but
the
that's
message
exactly, and that's
usually.
the point. Like I figured if it was interfering with the live stream, hopefully your sound person knew that was the crowd mic and I can mute the crowd mic because we don't need to, because if it's not that, what you have the couple who's like you have like the freshly new like seminary student sitting there making critiques and criticisms over the pastor's sermon and picking that up on the mic. Like, well, and I think the other thing too is I remember when Peter was born, and he's a kid. So a lot of times, like after Sunday school, he would run into the sanctuary and run to either find me or Laura, right? And he'd be very excited, or he wants to go sit with his friends. And I remember, and I think this person's intention was really good. But I remember she told me one time, like, hey, you got to be careful with your son running in here because there's times where, like, and mention like an older member's name. Like, there's times where I've seen that guy like slap a kid across the face because they're running in the sanctuary, which then terrified the crap out of me. I'm thinking, okay, I don't want my kid to get physically abused in the sanctuary of the church because he's having fun because he had a great day in Sunday school and he's excited to see mom and I. And B, what am I going to do in that moment if I see that? Am I going to lose my job? Because I'm probably going to react not very Christ-like in that moment. if someone
Yeah.
puts their hands on my child. Like, so I think so, and I think a lot of times that had kind of got me a I think even that just kind of still affected me in some ways. And even though, that guy, sometimes he could be conceived as a grunt, but he's like the nicest, sweetest guy in the world. And I could never, ever see him do that ever. Um, but one of the things is like a couple weeks ago, actually, I think like about a month ago, we were doing a service and it was like some type of special like kid service that one of my leaders was doing. And during worship, my daughter and a couple of girls her age stood up. They went into the middle aisle and they just started like waving their arms in the air and they're kind of jumping up and down and they're having a great time. And there's a part of me that's like, okay, I want them to worship the way they want to worship because they're not really being too distracting. It's not like they're slapping each other or pulling each other's hair or whatnot. They're just dancing, having a good time. But then there's also a part of me that goes, like there's that part of me that goes, I like, oh, please don't act that way. Come back, come back, come back. Sit down, sit down, sit down. Like and I think, and I think it's kind of that culture of, how well is the culture of your congregation where are you open to be able to have kids be able to be in service in worship or be in service, and even if it's an infant, if they're making noise, are you someone who's going to say, hey, your kid needs to get out of here now? Or are you somebody who might say, hey, just want to let you know we have a nursery, we have options for you. Um, but I think overall, as a church and as church leaders, you have to really assess, is the worship space that everybody worships in, is this a space that children can be open and free to worship in and be themselves, both through their crying mess, through their stinky diapers, through everything, and everybody's just going to be okay with it, or they're going to say, that's great that this young family's here, they brought their kid in worship, let's celebrate that instead of let's shame them because they're making too much racket. And I think that, and I think overall, I think parents kind of know. I mean, there's some parents who, they'll sit there, their kid will start cooing and they'll rock them a little bit. But once the kid starts getting too fussy, they know, like, okay, I need to excuse myself because it's getting too distracting and I just need to move my kid out of the space. Like, I don't think there's anybody there like, I'm just going to let my kid just be wild and crazy and scream and cry and fuss. And I'm just going to sit there and enjoy service while there's a kid wailing ridiculously loud right next door in their room. Like, I think parents have very good judgment of like, hey, we need to excuse ourselves temporarily to get our kids settled. And then once you're settled, once we figure out maybe we change a diaper, burp them, do whatever, and then we're going to bring them back in service because that's what we feel comfortable with. And I think that should be celebrated. And I think that should be celebrated. Yeah. Any final thoughts from you, Micah?
Uh, I mean, the only really real thing as we were talking that I was thinking about was that, we often, I don't think I understood this till I became a parent myself, but like, as somebody who has been going to church rather than working for the church in the last couple of years, I still fill in, I still do marketing and stuff on the side for churches and consulting. But like as an active ministry role on a Sunday morning, at any particular church, I find myself like when I was on staff, sitting in the auditorium or the sanctuary or whatever you want to call it, the idea of I wasn't really upset that people's kids were making noises as much as like I was afraid somebody else was going to say something and then I was going to hear about it as a staff member
Mm.
or our staff was going to hear about it. And then on the flip side, after having a child, like like you just said, you learn to kind of weigh out the noise. Like you have as a parent, you kind of have a noise meter. That sounds kind of weird. A noise meter um, that can indicate whether or not your kiddo is making too much noise. If it's just a little bit of noise, and you can rock them and soothe them and make sure that they're doing okay and they don't need anything like a diaper change or a bottle or whatever, then you're good. But if you know they're going to be inconsolable, then yeah, you may want to get up, excuse yourself, and then figure it out. And if you can console them, feed them, change your diaper, etc., and get them calmed down, you can come back. Like I don't see that being an issue. Um, I think you just have to balance it and keep reminding yourself that that you know like your ushers, your greeters, your teams that welcome people into the church. Like if this is a first time visit for somebody and their kiddo is making noise, telling them to leave probably isn't a great move because they're probably not going to come back. But like you said, if you offer the suggestion of there is childcare, there is a cry room, there are options. If your kid gets upset, you need a place to go. We have that. There are ways to handle that, and ways to train your teams to adapt and offer the solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say too, like I think it's also needs to be training on just your greeters, your ushers, even like your welcome center people. Like if you're noticing a family or a new family coming in, make sure they know about your child protection policy. Because I think a lot of times they don't want to put their kid in a room because they don't know if they have one, especially since, my experiences, the last two churches I worked at didn't really have anything written down saying, here is our policy when it comes to children and youth. Like nothing. They just say, oh, this is what we do, but there's nothing that you can say. So even if you just say, hey, we have this, here's this information about our child protection policy. All of our volunteers have background checks, and even you can just be very short about saying, hey, we have a nursery, we have Sunday school, we have a kids area that your kids can go to during service. It's all, if you would like to do that, here's how you, if you would like to put your kids in there, here's how you do that. Here's some information about our child protection policy. And then that's all you have to do. And again, welcome to our church. And that's it. And then if your staff is trained, that might be something. Or like, if the kid's being like loud and the mother or the father takes the kid out and they're just out kind of in the narthex, making sure the kid burps or something, that might be something too, where your usher could just say, hey, get to know them, talk with them, just say, hey, did anyone tell you about, our optional child areas and for your kids to go to? And they may say, oh yeah, someone told us. We're just, right now we're just kind of checking things out. I'm like, oh, that's perfectly fine. If no one told, if no one told you, we just want to make sure that there are options for you if you choose to take advantage of them. And then that's it. Like, just communication and proper training will go a long way into making sure all families, especially families of young kids or older kids, can feel like they're a part of your congregation. But friends, that's going to do it for us. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and a wonderful weekend. And we'll be back on with another episode. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.